Welcome to Hourglass Secrets, where today we unravel one of the most notorious and chilling cases from 19th century England. Picture the rural county of Essex in the 1840s. Modest cottages scattered across thin farmland, long lanes connecting small villages, and communities surviving under the weight of poor harvests and rising bread prices. Life was hard, particularly for women like Sarah Chesham, who grew up in Clavering with no meaningful access to education, destined to a life of domestic labour and limited opportunity. Sarah married Richard Chesham in 1828, both barely 19, and began a family in a small cottage surrounded by similar households struggling on intermittent farm work. Tragedy struck early. Several of their children died in infancy, a heartbreaking but not uncommon occurrence for labouring families. These repeated losses, combined with the strain of poverty, defined the backdrop of Sarah's life. Medical resources were minimal, and care for the sick rested heavily on women, who carried the weight of households barely surviving on seasonal wages. By the mid-1840s, two of Sarah's surviving children, Joseph and James, fell ill with severe vomiting, abdominal pain, and rapid physical decline. Dr. John Hawkes, the local medical practitioner, diagnosed what resembled English cholera, then prevalent in rural districts. Both boys died within days, and their burial proceeded with little scrutiny, reflecting a time when the sudden death of children was tragically frequent. In June 1846, Sarah visited the nearby village of Manewden, bringing a small portion of rice pudding and an apple turnover for Lydia Taylor's infant son, Solomon. Within a day, Solomon became violently ill and died shortly after, once again amid the limited medical care typical of the area. This prompted Lydia Taylor to submit a formal complaint to the magistrates, alleging intentional harm. As the coroner, Charles Carn Lewis, ordered an exhumation, but the initial analysis by Professor Alfred Swain Taylor revealed no presence of arsenic. Despite this, concern lingered, and the authorities decided to examine the bodies of Joseph and James. When exhumed later in 1846, Professor Taylor's analysis revealed significant quantities of arsenic, enough to explain the children's deaths. The discovery transformed what had initially been considered domestic tragedy into a serious criminal matter. A search of the Chesham household uncovered packets of white arsenic and other powders, further heightening suspicion. This paragraph establishes the harsh realities of rural Essex, the tragic context of Sarah's family, and the beginning of suspicion that would culminate in one of England's most infamous poisoning cases. It sets the scene for the complex mix of poverty, limited medical understanding, and the dangerous accessibility of arsenic that characterized the period. Before we begin, if you're here, hit subscribe and tell me, what state are you listening from? By the autumn of 1846, the deaths of Joseph and James Chesham had drawn the attention of local authorities. What had once been regarded as unfortunate but common fatalities now demanded closer scrutiny. Professor Alfred Swain Taylor, a leading toxicologist at Guy's Hospital, was tasked with examining the exhumed bodies. His analysis revealed high levels of arsenic, a discovery that immediately shifted the perception of these deaths from natural tragedy to potential criminal poisoning. In rural Essex, arsenic was widely available for pest control, sold openly in shops. Yet the quantities found in Joseph and James were unmistakably deliberate, enough to cause their rapid and fatal decline. The discovery prompted a thorough search of the Chesham household. Superintendent John Perry of the Essex Constabulary oversaw the investigation, and several packets of arsenic, along with other powders, were recovered. In isolation, possession of arsenic was not illegal, but in context, the findings were alarming. Local newspapers began reporting on what became known as the Chesham poisoning case, and whispers of suspicion spread through Clavering and neighbouring villages. The public fascination was immediate. This was no ordinary domestic misfortune, but a story that gripped the imagination and stoked fear. Meanwhile, the case took a more personal turn when Lydia Taylor came forward. She claimed that during Sarah's visit earlier that year, she had been asked to prepare a dish for her own husband using a special seasoning. Mrs. Taylor interpreted this as arsenic, reportedly concealed beneath a nearby oak tree by Sarah. This testimony, combined with the toxicological evidence, intensified suspicion. Yet discrepancies remained. Solomon Taylor's body, exhumed for examination, showed no traces of arsenic, creating a complex and challenging case for the authorities. Throughout this period, Sarah Chesham maintained a quiet presence. She offered no explanation, called no witnesses, and provided no statements. Her silence, while legally within her rights, contributed to the growing unease and suspicion in the community. Meanwhile, Richard Chesham's health began to deteriorate. Neighbours observed signs of wasting, vomiting, and breathing difficulties. Dr. Hawkes, the local practitioner, diagnosed him with advanced pulmonary disease, consistent with consumption, but the combination of the prior toxicological findings and Mrs. Taylor's testimony cast doubt on this conclusion. As months passed, the accumulation of evidence, chemical analysis, witness statements, and observed health decline was deemed sufficient to proceed with formal charges. 3 counts of murder were prepared: the deaths of Joseph and James Chesham and the death of Solomon Taylor. The case was scheduled for trial, and by early 1847, public attention in Essex was riveted. This was a rural community suddenly thrust into a matter that had legal, medical, and social implications far beyond anything they had encountered before. This paragraph highlights the transition from tragedy to criminal investigation, the critical role of toxicology, and the mounting tension in the community. It sets the stage for Sarah's eventual arrest and trial, showing how a combination of scientific evidence and personal testimony can transform suspicion into formal legal action. By early 1850, the attention of local authorities intensified as Richard Chesham's health sharply declined. Neighbours reported that he was suffering from persistent vomiting, severe weakness, and difficulty breathing, symptoms that, while consistent with consumption, now appeared alarmingly similar to those associated with arsenic exposure. Superintendent John Perry, already familiar with the earlier deaths of Joseph, James, and Solomon Taylor, began to treat Richard's illness with increased suspicion. On the 5th of September 1850, Sarah Chesham was formally apprehended at her Clavering cottage. During the search of her home, constables uncovered rice mixed with visible grains of white arsenic, along with several additional packets concealed under the bed and in corners of the room. These items were carefully collected, sealed, and sent to Chelmsford for analysis. The evidence suggested that arsenic was not only present in the household, but had been stored deliberately, further raising concerns about intentional administration. Simultaneously, the authorities arranged for the exhumation of Richard Chesham from the churchyard in Clavering. Professor Alfred Swain Taylor once again undertook the chemical examination. His findings revealed traces of arsenic in Richard's stomach, hair, and nails, indicating prolonged exposure. While the quantities alone were not sufficient to account for immediate death, when considered alongside the previous poisonings and witness testimony, the evidence painted a troubling pattern of repeated exposure and potential intent. Mrs. Hannah Phillips, a neighbour and long-time acquaintance of the Chesham family, provided critical testimony. She reported that Sarah had asked her to prepare a dish for her husband, Joseph Phillips, while supplying a special seasoning believed to be arsenic. Mrs. Phillips recalled Sarah's statements indicating that the substance was intended to hasten the decline of Richard's health. Her testimony, delivered with precision despite her prior silence for nearly 2 years, added a personal and human dimension to the mounting scientific evidence. The combination of toxicological results, witness statements, and the observable decline in Richard's condition created a strong case for the authorities. Parishioners contributed further observations, noting Sarah's resistance to assistance during her husband's illness and the unusual circumstances surrounding the previous deaths. Despite these accumulating facts, Sarah remained silent, offering no explanation and calling no witnesses to her defense. Her quiet presence in the courtroom and at her home compounded the sense of unease and suspicion among the community and authorities alike. This paragraph illustrates the turning point from suspicion to formal arrest, the critical role of forensic toxicology, and the community's growing awareness of a potentially dangerous pattern. It demonstrates how the convergence of medical science, witness testimony, and careful investigation built the case that would ultimately lead to the inquest and trial. Following Sarah Chesham's arrest, the authorities arranged an inquest to examine the circumstances surrounding her husband's death and the earlier deaths of her children. The inquest was held at the Red Lion Inn in Clavering, drawing attention from local villagers, parishioners, and journalists eager to witness a case that had already captured the county's imagination. The atmosphere was tense. Whispers of poison and suspicion had spread throughout Essex, and the public was captivated by the unfolding events. Mrs. Hannah Phillips was the first witness. She reiterated her testimony regarding Sarah's instructions to prepare a dish for her husband, Joseph Phillips, with a special seasoning that she believed to be arsenic. She also described Sarah's comments about hastening Richard's decline and the careful concealment of the poison beneath a nearby oak tree. Her testimony was delivered calmly, yet every word added weight to the mounting evidence against Sarah. Dr. John Hawkes provided medical insight into Richard Chesham's final illness. While he had initially attributed Richard's symptoms to pulmonary disease, he acknowledged that vomiting, abdominal distress, and wasting could also align with arsenic exposure. His professional opinion, combined with the findings of Professor Alfred Swain Taylor, painted a clearer picture of the potential causes behind Richard's deterioration. Taylor, presenting his toxicological analysis, confirmed the presence of arsenic in Richard's stomach, hair, and nails, explaining the procedures used to detect the substance. His testimony was critical, providing the scientific foundation necessary to support the suspicion of deliberate poisoning. Additional parishioners contributed to the inquest, offering observations on Sarah's behavior and the household conditions. Some noted her resistance to help during Richard's final days, while others described the decline in the children and the unusual circumstances surrounding their deaths. These personal accounts, though limited in detail, created a comprehensive narrative that linked Sarah to repeated instances of arsenic exposure within her family and the surrounding community. Throughout the inquest, Sarah remained silent. She offered no explanations, responded minimally when addressed, and did not call witnesses. Her quiet presence only intensified the tension in the room, leaving jurors and onlookers to interpret her behavior alongside the mounting scientific and testimonial evidence. The combination of toxicology, witness statements, and the pattern of repeated deaths made it increasingly difficult for the jury to dismiss the case as mere misfortune. At the conclusion of the proceedings, the jury returned a verdict that recognized the gravity of the evidence and warranted further judicial consideration. Sarah Chesham was formally committed for trial at the Chelmsford Assizes. This inquest served as a critical moment in the story, transforming what had begun as a series of tragic family deaths into a public and legal matter of considerable importance, with the eyes of the community and the press now firmly fixed upon Clavering. Sarah Chesham's trial began on the 8th of March 1851 at the Chelmsford Assizes, attracting a large crowd. News of the case had spread throughout Essex, and the courtroom was filled with villagers, journalists, and those eager to witness the legal proceedings against the woman accused of multiple poisonings. The gravity of the situation was immediately apparent. This was a rural community, confronting a case that blended domestic tragedy with criminal suspicion on a scale rarely seen. The Crown Prosecutor opened the trial by presenting the history of the Chesham family, recounting the deaths of Joseph and James, the findings from the exhumations, and the more recent circumstances surrounding Richard Chesham's illness and death. The prosecution emphasized the combination of toxicological evidence, witness testimony from Hannah Phillips, and the recovered arsenic as proof of deliberate poisoning. The case was laid out methodically, highlighting the repeated pattern of arsenic exposure and the suspicious circumstances surrounding each death. Throughout the trial, Sarah Chesham remained silent. She did not call witnesses or make statements in her defense. Her silence, whether due to shock, resignation, or strategy, added a tense dimension to the courtroom proceedings. The prosecution relied heavily on Professor Alfred Swain Taylor's evidence, describing in detail the methods used to detect arsenic and confirming its presence in the remains of the Chesham children and in Richard's stomach, hair, and nails. Dr. Hawkes also gave testimony regarding Richard's final illness, acknowledging that the symptoms observed could be consistent with arsenic exposure. Witnesses from the community, including parishioners and neighbours, were questioned about Sarah's behaviour, her handling of household tasks, and the peculiar circumstances surrounding the deaths. Many described her as SEC, retive or uncooperative during times of illness, which, when combined with the scientific evidence, strengthened the prosecution's narrative. Hannah Phillips' testimony was particularly compelling, providing a direct account of Sarah's alleged instructions and the storage of arsenic, bridging the gap between the chemical evidence and observed actions. After the closing speeches, the jury retired to deliberate. The combination of scientific proof, eyewitness testimony, and the documented pattern of deaths proved persuasive. Upon returning, the jury delivered a guilty verdict, convicting Sarah Chesham of the murder of her husband, Richard Chesham, by administration of arsenic. The judge sentenced her to death and ordered that her remains be buried within the precincts of the prison, following the regulations for such cases. This trial marked the culmination of years of suspicion, investigation, and legal scrutiny. It highlighted the emerging role of forensic toxicology in criminal justice and the complex interplay between community observation, medical expertise, and the legal system in 19th-century rural England. The conviction of Sarah Chesham became a landmark case, remembered not only for its tragic details, but also for its influence on the understanding and prosecution of poisoning cases in the Victorian era. On the morning of the 25th of March 1851, Sarah Chesham's sentence was carried out at Springfield Prison. Shortly after 8 a.m., the execution took place under strict legal regulations, confined to officials required by law, though a considerable number of people gathered outside the prison gates, drawn by the notoriety of the case. Following the execution, her remains were interred within the prison grounds without ceremony, in accordance with the court's directive. The conclusion of the case marked the end of a prolonged period of fear, suspicion, and tragedy for the communities of Clavering and Manewden. In the aftermath, debates emerged regarding the evidence presented during the trial. Some medical commentators questioned whether the arsenic levels in Richard Chesham's body were sufficient to prove deliberate poisoning, suggesting contamination from household utensils or common medicinal compounds as alternative explanations. Others noted that Sarah's silence might have been misinterpreted, pointing out that her prior acquittal and the hardships of managing a poor household over decades could explain her resigned demeanor rather than indicate guilt. Despite these arguments, the legal system adhered to its judgment, and no clemency was granted. The case of Sarah Chesham left a lasting impression on both the local community and the broader understanding of toxicology and criminal justice in rural England. Newspapers and official reports kept the story alive, making it a reference point for future cases of suspected poisoning. Scholars later reflected on the difficulties faced by poor defendants in the Victorian legal system, the reliance on emerging forensic science, and the social stigma attached to women accused of crimes within tight-knit communities. For Clavering and surrounding villages, the memory of the Chesham case lingered long after the events themselves. Neighbours and parishioners had witnessed a series of deaths that, when examined collectively, revealed the potential dangers of easily accessible poisons like arsenic. The story underscored the intersection of poverty, limited medical knowledge, and the vulnerabilities of domestic life in 19th-century rural England, providing a cautionary tale that resonated through the decades. Today, the case of Sarah Chesham is remembered as one of the most infamous arsenic poisonings in English history. It serves as a reminder of the critical role forensic toxicology plays in understanding cause of death, the challenges of interpreting circumstantial evidence, and the importance of due process. Beyond its historical significance, the story highlights the human dimensions of tragedy, fear, and suspicion, illustrating how a single household's misfortune can ripple through an entire community, capturing the attention of authorities, the press, and the public alike.